Let's start from the beginning then, Paul. Can you just lay out what the central thesis of the book is?
The central thesis of the book is that there was a premeditated campaign that started in 2017, which sort of coagulated around a particular actor, Morgan McSweeney, and his political allies, in particular Steve Reed MP, who was very close to, who set about taking over the Labour Party, capturing the Labour Party for their tiny faction, knowing full well that if they were honest and open about their ambitions, they probably wouldn't succeed. They used a whole series of dodgy, dirty tricks to destroy the Labour Party from within, so as to create the conditions where they could choose their preferred leader, which is Keir Starmer, and then use his leadership to take control of the Labour Party and then fundamentally capture it and transform it into a totally different beast to what it used to be. And then with that, capture state power. And capture state power using the same methodologies that used to capture the Labour Party, which was to be incredibly censorious, to be authoritarian, but to be deeply misleading and dishonest to the public about what they intended to do. Embed dishonesty and deception into the heart of their political methodology. The result of which is this government that is pretty much universally already loathed. It has the lowest polling ratings. Keir Starmer's got the lowest polling ratings of any prime minister. Deeply, deeply unhappy, and a situation which is ripe for the rise of the far right and reform, which is effectively an expression of an understandable anti-establishment anger because the establishment in Keir Starmer has gained power through really an astonishing litany of like reckless and lawless behavior and misconduct, which I think has deeply wounded our democracy and has put us into a very dangerous and vulnerable place.
So you mention in the book a phone call from Morgan McSweeney to the Electoral Commission. Can you explain why that's so important and give us the context around that?
Sure. So for me, the beginning and the heart of the Labour Together project, for me, is an act of illegality, which is this failure to report £740,000 in donations, which then is then used to do those two things, to destroy Corbynism and also incubate Keir Starmer's leadership campaign. So effectively, our current government is incubated with this pot of undeclared money, this illegality. It's where it comes from. Now, they were found guilty and the Electoral Commission fined them, but the excuse that Labour Together gave was that this was just an administrative oversight, this is just human error. And for me, that doesn't hang together. I think it's at least as plausible that it was human oversight as it is plausible that actually Morgan McSweeney chose not to report those donations. And the key, and I mobilized a whole bunch of evidence in support of that. It's not just like a random hunch. And one of those key pieces of evidence for me is these FOIs that got out of the Electoral Commission in December 2023. And what those show, and what I asked the Electoral Commission is any correspondence or records of phone calls between Morgan McSweeney and Labour Together and the Electoral Commission over a certain period of time. What it shows in November 2017, Morgan McSweeney calls the Electoral Commission and he says, I'm from Labour Together. I don't think we should report donations. I don't want to report donations. I don't think we should report donations. I don't want to report donations because we're not public facing, because we don't campaign. Although at that stage, they're already planning, at least in their minds, to incubate Starmer's leadership campaign later, or some person's leadership campaign a bit later. And he says, can you please advise me on whether I need to report donations or not? And then very shortly thereafter, an Electoral Commission employee sends him an email where it explicitly says, yes, you're a members association, you have MPs on your board, your majority made up of MPs, you're a members association, you must report donations. Anything over £7,500, you must report. You must report them in 30 days. You must report them using this form. This is where you can download the form. It's very clear guidance. There's no way you read that and you take an ambiguous reading of what the Electoral Commission is saying. But then there's further correspondence where Morgan McSweeney has messed up filling in a form and the Electoral Commission is writing to saying, like, please correct it, which shows very plainly that Morgan McSweeney has understood from that correspondence, because after that first letter, that he has a duty to report donations and how to report donations and where to report donations. And yet thereafter, he doesn't. So that raises the question. There's no way that he can run, the argument can be run that Morgan McSweeney didn't know he had to report donations. But there's other evidence as well, right? So in 2019, there's a meeting in Parliament, and Gabriel Pogren writes about this and Patrick Maguire, where Labour MPs ask Morgan McSweeney about Labour Together, and they say to him, is Labour Together required to report donations, and are you on top of it? And he tells them, yes, I'm reporting donations, when he's not reporting donations. And in fact, he doesn't report a single donation for all of 2019. And then again, in 2019, in April 2019, Labour Together launches its website, relaunches the website, and it says explicitly on the website, we are reporting donations. If you go to Electoral Commission, you can search them. And then in February 2020, Shabana Mahmood, now the Home Secretary, writes an article for Labourist, which says Labour Together is reporting donations when it's not. So you have all of this in the midst of a political project that has already identified secrecy as its watchword and discovery and detection as its greatest threat. Now, what do you think would happen if Labour Together in January 2020 had, by then, I think it would have been £500,000, had disclosed they'd received £500,000 in donations when they have a shonky website and they've hosted a couple of meetings in village halls with Shabana would be nice to people. People would be like, what have you done with £500,000? What are you doing here? This is crazy. This within the Labour Party, within those circles, that's a lot of money, right? It's like almost as much as Momentum is taking, not quite, but it's in that region. It would start asking people, what are you doing with this stuff? What have you been doing? You also now you've become Keir Starmer's campaign manager. What was Labour Together doing all this time beforehand that you needed £500,000? That doesn't make any sense to us, considering what we can see in public. So that's what I sort of mobilise as the evidence to say, like, I think actually questions need to be asked. And then the final piece of evidence is this famous email, which has now become known as the Shamash email. The Shamash email is from Labour Together solicitor Gerald Shamash, and it's written to Morgan McSweeney, and it's in the midst of the Electoral Commission's investigation into the Labour Party. And I don't quite know how the Tories have gotten hold of it. They've published it online. They called it the McSweeney files, or something called like What Labour Knew. And this email is basically Shamash talking to Morgan McSweeney about what happened, why they didn't report donations, and it's effectively floated in this email that maybe they shouldn't disclose certain things to the Electoral Commission, including some of their correspondence or engagements that Morgan McSweeney might have had with the Electoral Commission, which then has raised the very real question of like, well, how candid were they with the Electoral Commission in their investigation? Did they tell them everything? Was the Electoral Commission aware of these November phone calls or this correspondence? Did they know about it? If they did, how did they? Is the fine that they levied appropriate? Because once you think, it's plainly illegal. It's illegal to not report donations. That's established. But if you purposefully don't report donations, then it becomes a different set of offences that the Electoral Commission no longer looks at, has to refer to the police effectively at that point. And the question now raises, like, well, was this investigation complete? Was the sanction legitimate? Should it maybe have been referred somewhere else? And I still feel like those are unanswered questions, primarily because the Electoral Commission has absolutely refused to release any information about it. I've submitted endless FOI requests. I've argued with them for years, saying, please release the report of your investigation, like you've done with other investigations, and they've refused. And I think until we get those reports, and we know what Labour Together told the Electoral Commission, and we know how the Electoral Commission concluded its investigation, we'll always have questions about whether it was appropriate and legitimate and proportionate.
And you start the book with a rather chilling tale about private investigations that you allege Labour Together launched after it realised you were investigating them. Can you take us through what happened there and what your proof is for that?
So the story starts probably in August 2023. By then, I'd been working on the book for quite a long time already. I'd gotten access to this leak of documents from within the Labour Party, sort of 2021, 2022. And I realized looking through this material that there were like serious alarm bells here. And I worried about the impact it would have on our democracy long term. So what I did, it was in 2023, I took certain documents to the Sunday Times, to a journalist called Gabriel Pogrund. And the documents were about the fact that Labour Together between early 2018 and mid 2020 had failed to report £740,000 in donations that they received. And it's not an opinion. That absolutely, they failed to report those donations. It's illegal. They were found guilty of that. The Electoral Commission said, yes, you broke the law. So I took documents to the Sunday Times, which raised questions about what happened here. Like, why did they not report those donations? And more importantly, when the Electoral Commission investigated them, were they candid in their responses? Did they tell the Electoral Commission everything? I think now we know, based on some of the stuff that has been published, that that's a reasonable question to ask. And certainly there seems to be at least one email where there was a discussion about not disclosing everything to the Electoral Commission. And Sunday Times ran an article, and then at the bottom of the article, it said, the article wasn't in my name, but it said at the bottom, Paul Holden has provided us documents for this article and is publishing a book. At the same time, my publisher put up a page for my book, and then I was approached by the Telegraph, who had some of their own internal leaks. We were collaborating on a story, and they then sent writer replies to Labour Together and to Morgan McSweeney. And I didn't hear anything for a while. Then suddenly I got this email out of the blue from Pippa Creer, who's the deputy editor at The Guardian. And she said, we're basically tomorrow we're going to run a story which is going to say that there's an investigation by the National Cybersecurity Centre investigating whether material hacked by a foreign state from the Electoral Commission is being used to undermine the Labour Party, British democracy, and the investigation will also include you because you're being investigated potentially for having some of these documents. And I was just like, what on earth is this? This is mad. Like, I've never even heard of this hack. This is crazy. I Googled it and I found out there was actually a hack of Electoral Commission, but obviously it's like it totally took me by surprise. And I pushed back very hard and I basically said, look, if you report this is an insane allegation about me. I've not been contacted by the NCSC before or since. I plainly haven't gotten documents from this hack. And I basically said, if you write an article saying that sort of stuff, I'll sue you into the ground for defamation. And the article disappeared. But it was very alarming because at that time I was very worried that, if they did run an article like that, it'd be extremely damaging to my reputation, I thought at least. That people would start wondering, like, this guy's under investigation for Russian hacks and he's trying to under the Labour Party. Plainly, there would be, I would have a lot of difficulty explaining to my funders because I get philanthropic funding. Like, why are you being linked to Russia? It would undermine the investigations I was doing, I thought, into Morgan McSweeney. But then again, I saw it off, didn't think about it anymore. Then I went back and I read Pippa Creer's email, and basically what she said to me in that email was it was Labour Together that had reported me to the National Cybersecurity. So there wasn't this like self-initiated process. So Labour Together had reported me at the same time as we'd submitted an FOI request about a very damaging disclosure. So again, I was like, this is very weird. But then I thought it was just desperate, right? I didn't think it came from anything. And then later that year, I think it was July, or sort of around after the election, as far as I remember, I got a call from this journalist friend of mine who's phenomenal. This is a phenomenal investigative journalist who's like broken crazy big stories around the world. Serious journalist. And what she was working on at the time was all these, in London in particular, you have all these reputation management firms and they get hired by, arms companies, tobacco companies, well, pretty much anybody, right? And they have to deal with like things that are reputationally damaging to them. Often journalists, whistleblowers, and those people also then subcontract some services to like private security agencies and private security companies. And she was investigating that sort of cluster of reputation management firms and the private security companies they use. And she said to me, look, your name's come up. And I was very shocked. And I said, yeah, I thought you must be mistaken. You might be thinking about my friend, Andrew Feinstein, who she knows very well, because Andrew Feinstein's done lots of work on the global arms trade. And, me and Andrew have, over time, but certainly more Andrew than me, has pissed off arms dealers around the world and big arms companies. He said, no, it's you. And I've been told they're looking into your family and to where you live and to your colleagues. And I was really quite shocked by that. And this person who called me in South Africa doesn't know my family. And she mentioned a family member by name. And I was like, she knows. Like, that's not public knowledge. So plainly she'd gotten some like very good intelligence. And then over time, I started seeing some of the reports that had been written. What had happened is that in November, as that Sunday Times article came out, Labour Together had hired one of these reputation management firms, and they were basically doing like a deep dive into me, into my family, into anybody I knew, and to write up a report about my investigation. But what they were also looking into is like, where did I get my information from? What are my sources? What else am I going to say? And I was told, although I didn't actually see the report on this, I was told my source told me that eventually, the whole thing moved on to trying to link me to Russia, which is like an absurd, mad allegation. And the one thing that I was struck by was that I was then told that, and I saw some copies of these emails, that there was an MP called Josh Simons who was on the email exchanges. Now, Josh Simons was at the time a director of Labour Together. He then becomes like this very pugnacious face for them. And then as the election is called in 2024, he's parachuted into a safe seat. He's now in the cabinet office, right? Effectively, a pretty high profile, and he's seen as like a rising star. This guy's going to be incredibly influential in the Labour Party.
Talk about the creation of Labour Together, some of the people involved, why they said it was created, and why you argue it was created.
So originally, Labour Together was created in 2015, and the key mover there is a guy called John Cruddas, who I actually ended up interviewing quite a bit for the book. And John Cruddas is, he's on, I would say, he's part of what they call the blue Labour tendency in the Labour Party, which argues for like a mixture of like radical workerist economics. So like we need to be less investing loads of money in the defense industry because it creates jobs, but is socially conservative. But generally speaking, he is considered like a historian of the party. He's written multiple books about the party and is like well liked across the party's factions because he has an understanding and I think quite a genuine appreciation of the fact that the Labour Party is made up of these different constituent factions and elements, and the party is better for it because these factions working together in collaboration is a dynamic process that produces ideas and an interesting, and you can bring together a large voting coalition, all sorts of things. It makes sense to have these factions working together. And his initial intention was like, when Jeremy Corbyn was elected, he was worried that right-wing Labour MPs, sort of Blairite types like West Streeting, would leave the party, would split the party in two, and the Labour Party would be out of power for a generation as a result. There would basically be a repeat of, the Thatcher moment. So he created it, as this vehicle to discuss sort of issues that were key to him, like localism, but also to sort of foster this unity across the party. And I developed this, they weren't particularly well known, but developed a reputation in the Labour Party as sort of a cross-factional, let's work together sort of organization. But it fundamentally transforms in 2017. And I should say it fundamentally transforms in ways that John Cruddas doesn't even seem to realize at the time, because when I approached him and spoke to him, he was like utterly astonished by the things I was telling him that subsequently happened. And the change, the trigger for the change in Labour Together is the 2017 general election. Because within the Labour Party, within the right wing of the Labour Party, which despises Jeremy Corbyn, and all of his supporters and all the members who support him, quite often I wonder how much they also hate the voters who voted for him. They all thought Jeremy Corbyn was going to fail spectacularly. Like there's going to be, as soon as there's a general election, the public will see this guy. They'll think he's a crazy, cranky, loony guy. He'll get 15% of the polls. The Labour Party will be wiped out. And then we can just forget about it and move on, choose another, David Miliband or somebody to replace him. But Jeremy Corbyn gets 40% of the national vote, right? He doesn't win the election. That's only the third time since 1974 the Labour Party's ever gotten more than 40% of the national vote. Only two times with Tony Blair and Jeremy Corbyn. And still only Jeremy Corbyn and Tony Blair since 1974. Which means that in the party, Jeremy Corbyn is effectively unassailable. He's extremely, suddenly Corbyn has proven that he can be electable. He's got all this momentum behind him. After the election, there's all this polling which is showing that actually if the election was run again, the Labour Party won handily. This, for people like Morgan McSweeney, is an emergency, right? Because he despises, according to Gabriel and Patrick Maguire and Anushka Stani, he despises the left. He thinks the Corbynite left is evil, which is a pretty strong opinion to have about your political opponents. Like, I can dislike the Labour right wing, I don't think they're evil. And he basically goes to Labour Together and they decide they're going to concoct a plan to put this right. And what that means effectively is that in July 2017, McSweeney distributes this document, this planning document, this strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threat analysis, a SWOT analysis. And it sets out a plan for what Labour Together is going to do over the short to medium term. And it's two very simple things. One, it's going to destroy Corbynism. It's going to identify all the things that make Corbynism successful, and it's going to systematically seek to undermine them. And then having undermined them, it'll then catalyze the Labour Party losing the next election, which will then finally dislodge Jeremy Corbyn. With Jeremy Corbyn dislodged and the party in fire, they will then choose the next leadership contender and then run that leadership contender to take over the party again and make sure that somebody like Jeremy Corbyn could never be elected again, ever. Like they'll shut the door on the left wing of the Labour Party for good this time. No, like nicey stuff. It's over for the left wing once they win. The problem they have is they can't actually do that in public. Because first of all, the views that they eventually, that they actually inhabit this faction that they represent, which is all, not particularly ideologically coherent, but it's effectively like a Blairite pro-imperialist faction. Nobody wants to vote for this stuff. It's not like there's no real constituency for this in the Labour Party. There's almost no constituency in the country, which is part of why they're so unpopular now. But Morgan McSweeney had run Liz Kendall's leadership campaign in 2015. She got 4.5% of the vote, right, against Jeremy Corbyn, who gets, way more than that. So they learn at that moment, like, oh, if we actually tell people what we want to do, which is cut welfare and basically be our version of the Tories, just more competent, we'll never get elected. But what they're also very worried about is being found out, is detection, being uncovered. So they basically developed this elaborate front cover, which they call Operation Red Shield. They're going to use the history of Labour Together as a cross-factional organisation and carry on presenting that as the actual work of Labour Together. So if you go onto their website and you look at their materials, they're not particularly active, but they do have their website from April 2019. It's very clear they're working for unity across all party factions. And it's that sort of act of deception, and it really is a premeditated campaign of disinformation, is to tell the public we're doing one thing when you're actually doing completely the opposite. It's misinformation, it's disinformation. And it's a pretty astonishing, if you think about it, the nuts and bolts of a campaign like that. It is really quite an astonishingly disturbing level of premeditated deception, which has to be played out not just on the public at large by having a website, but to people's faces. And I think one of the best examples of that, and I'll just tell a very brief story, is a guy called Neil Lawson, who's the director of an organization called Compass. Now, Compass is what Labour Together says it was. As in, Compass basically seeks to build a progressive alliance in the country. It says, look, there's actually, if you look at the polling, if you look at the Lib Dems, the Greens, the Labour Party, we're more than 50% of the population. We should be having progressive governments if we all work together. Let's find a way to collaborate. Let's stop factionalism within these movements. And Neil Lawson spent a lot of time with Morgan McSweeney. He introduces him to funders, he introduces him to other MPs, really like inserts Morgan McSweeney into his world. And Morgan McSweeney's telling Neil Lawson this entire time, like, what I'm planning to do is basically, I think we should do Corbynism without Corbyn. I believe totally in this radicalism. I believe totally in this radical economic agenda. It's stained by anti-Semitism and it's stained by Corbyn himself. And I want to achieve this. And now Neil Lawson is incredibly clear. He's written some very hard-hitting articles about it. He eventually gets suspended by McSweeney's party, which is very interesting. But he's written very explicitly, like, this guy came to me, he sat in my kitchen and he talked to me and I helped him. And what he was telling me was not true. He feels like he was conned, basically. That's the nuts and bolts of this sort of campaign. So they have this public campaign of misdirection, telling people that they're not factional, when they're doing a deeply factional project to effectively destroy the capacity of the Labour government, the Labour Party, to win the next election, which I've always thought is deeply irresponsible, considering what we know the Tories then did, right? And the 5 years of additional austerity and 5 years of like hard Brexit and all this sort of stuff I think is so wantonly reckless to be like, I want to control the Labour Party so much, I'm going to let Boris Johnson win. It's just maddening to me. As a Labour, I was a Labour Party member, a Labour Party voter. I feel very betrayed by that. And then they use this elaborate disguise to then do all these incredibly dodgy projects.
Yeah, let's move on to that then. So what do you think are the most shocking of the secret projects that Labour Together undertook?
I think there's two. They sort of relate to each other. And basically what we have is from early 2018, Morgan McSweeney is working full-time in the Labour Together offices. From about that time, I think it's about March 2018, he's basically stops declaring donations. No more donations are reported, but he's getting all this money in. He's working very closely with this guy called Imran Ahmed, who basically comes to work with him at the Labour Together offices. Imran Ahmed has like a long history in the Labour Party, on the right wing of the Labour Party. He's been a spin doctor and like a spad for all sorts of right-wing Labour MPs, and they have a factional agenda. And the two things they're doing simultaneously is, one, is they start working for 2018 to start facilitating the placement of stories about anti-Semitism in the Labour Party with journalists. The first article that we know about that they work on is this, I think, a very silly article in retrospect, which actually has quite a big impact at the time, which is this article called, I think it's called Corbyn's Hate Factories. And basically what it is that Morgan McSweeney and Imran Ahmed in the Labour Together office with their undisclosed money have joined a couple of Facebook groups and then have like assiduously sought through 4 million posts to find 2,000 posts they think are full, and illustrate aspects of hateful behavior, including anti-Semitism. And they've given that material to the Sunday Times. And the Sunday Times then writes up this thing about like Corbyn's Hate Factory. If you look at Corbyn's social media, these huge open public groups that have millions of members, we found all these incidents of hate, which then drives the narrative of the Labour Party under Corbyn, and the Corbyn supporting element of the Labour Party is just like utterly irredeemable because it's so anti-Semitic. Of course, if you look at the claims, they don't really stand up. First of all, we don't know of this 2,000 how many are anti-Semitism. We have no idea. That's never disclosed. And then you look at the examples of anti-Semitism they provide, and it's this very infuriating thing. It's this infuriating thing that actually defines the anti-Semitism crisis for me. Because on the one hand, there are serious incidents of anti-Semitism, but then people posting, one person, this woman by the name of Nobi Wimborne, Addressy posts, I think the anti-Semitism crisis, which is already raging at the time, is like a Blairite to far-right conspiracy. Now, Nani Wimborne-Idrissi is Jewish. It doesn't say that she's Jewish in the article, but she's Jewish. She's actually a very well-known Jewish anti-Zionist activist. And actually what she's describing is, in an article, she's been called anti-Semitic for saying, I think there might be a Blairite conspiracy here. And the article has been placed by a Blairite conspiracy. But the fact that she's calling out a Blairite conspiracy is treated as anti-Semitic. And it's sort of mind-bending stuff, right? So on the one hand, they are creating this narrative by giving stuff to journalists, and it does seem like later on they start working with all sorts of Labour Party insiders to handle leaks and that sort of stuff. But the really serious one, like the one that I think is just like utterly absurd and just unforgivable, is a campaign they start called Stop Funding Fake News. Now, Stop Funding Fake News, they launched in March 2019, and it's what I describe as an AstroTurf campaign, by which I mean they create a website and they create a Twitter profile, and they say, we're just a group of activists, just grassroots activists, just a bunch of friends who hate and hate misinformation. We're just going to fight the good fight. And they're very clever in the way that they adopt like a very powerful idiom at the time, which is quite a centrist idiom around like the fact that Donald Trump and Brexit won because of misinformation. It's a very fertile line to tap into, right? And their primary target is a website called The Canary, or media outlet called The Canary, which they accuse of publishing fake news and lies and hate. Now, the thing about The Canary is that back in 2017, Morgan McSweeney had specifically identified The Canary as a threat to their political ambitions. He said The Canary is a powerful media organization that helped Jeremy Corbyn do well in 2017. It is a key part of like a left-wing organizational ecosystem because effectively, what I see, the reason why I think it's a threat to Morgan McSweeney is because it's actively fact-checking some of the nonsense stuff that he's placing in the mainstream media. Right, that's the real threat that the Canary pose, and because they actually are making an argument that left-wing people aren't a bunch of crazy anti-Semitic thugs, but actually sort of normal people trying to make the world a bit better. So they run this horrific campaign, and it's very successful. They demonetize the Canary. What they do is they start these Twitter storms. They post this thread of evidence, and the evidence is really terrible. In fact, it's nonsense. Doesn't stand up at all. Saying the Canary is anti-Semitic. The Canary is publishing fake news. Macmillan Cancer Charity. Why are you advertising on here? And they create enough political pressure that on these brands, and these brands then they stop advertising on the Canary, and the Canary really loses a lot of money and has to change its whole model of operating. Right, it's very effective, and I'll come to they also then I think very idiotically and recklessly they target a whole bunch of Trump supporting sites. I think that's going to come and really bite them in the ass eventually when the White House realizes the current chief of staff, the Prime Minister, was also simultaneously censoring pro-Farage, pro-Trump sites. Right. But why is that successful? Because, first of all, just to puncture the AstroTurf thing, clearly these are not just grassroots activists, right? It's Morgan McSweeney, it's Imran Ahmed, it's with the knowledge of Steve Reed, in Labour Together's office, being funded by a huge amount of money they're not declaring for millionaire donors, right? That's about as far away from grassroots campaigning as you can possibly imagine. But they're successful because they're amplified by a particular group that's already sort of made headway on the anti-Semitism crisis. It's a group called Labour Against Anti-Semitism, and a celebrity called Rachel Riley, who's a presenter on Countdown. And we now know that actually, a month before Stop Funding Fake News launched, she was brought to Labour Together's offices by a guy called Adam Langleben from the Jewish Labour movement, and she was asked, do you want to front this campaign? She said yes. So she became the public face. If you look back at the Twitter record, Stop Funding Fake News starts, Rachel Riley is like one of the first people who tweets it out, magnifies it, and it gets big. And then Labour Against Anti-Semitism pick it up. Now, why is that problematic? Right. And the main reason it's problematic is because I think Labour Against Anti-Semitism are one of those groups that I believe can sometimes recklessly, not all the time, because they have identified anti-Semitism sometimes, but can sometimes be reckless in the way they make their allegations. And the way I illustrate it is with a character by the name of David Gordstein. And David Gordstein is not real. David Gordstein is not a real person. David Gordstein is a made-up fake identity of a man by the name of Ewan Phillips. And I should say, Ewan Phillips has been approached about this. Ewan Phillips said, yes, I created this identity. I wasn't pretending to be Jewish when I made up the name David Gordstein. I'll leave your listeners to decide on that. And the problem with David Gordstein as a character, and he comes up again and again and again in my book, because he shows up again and again and again, is that this character, David Gordstein, was used repeatedly to make complaints of anti-Semitism into the Labour Party and to accuse people of anti-Semitism, including a whole range of Jewish people. So you have this guy who's made up this identity. He's not Jewish. He's made up this identity called David Gordstein. and he's complaining about Jewish people being anti-Semitic. And then you look at the complaints, and they're mad. Some of them are just utterly mad. So the one that I thought was just like insane, it was so absurd, was that he submitted a complaint that David Gordstein was used to submit a complaint against Miriam Margolyes. She's a very well-known actress. She was in the Harry Potter series. She's a very well-known Jewish activist. And she's, quite critical of Israel. But, she's plainly, the idea that she's anti-Semitic is insane. And the evidence that's submitted to prove that she's anti-Semitic is that once on Facebook, she shared an article by another Jewish academic called David Graeber, a great article people should read. I think it's the best article ever written on the anti-Semitism crisis. I read that once a week. It is astonishing. In everything, David Graeber is right before everybody else, right? It's a terrible tragedy that he died. But he basically writes this article about the anti-Semitism crisis saying, I think this crisis is a problem because you have loads of non-Jewish people who are making Jewish people terrified beyond what I think is reasonable and justified. So you have, and because it's mind-bending, this stuff, so let me just describe it from the beginning to the end. You have Labour against anti-Semitism, of which a primary spokesperson is Ewan Phillips, which is amplifying an AstroTurf campaign started with money that's not been declared in violation of electoral law by a group of people who are pretending to be cross-factional party figures through Labour Together when they're actually working to destroy the Labour Party within. Labour against anti-Semitism spokesperson Ewan Phillips creates a fake identity called David Gordstein. That identity is then used to complain about a famous Jewish actress for sharing an article about a Jewish academic. And that Jewish academic is complaining about non-Jewish people posting alarmist stories about anti-Semitism. It is mind-bending stuff, right? Now, the reason I bring that up is because the first real success of Stop Funding Fake News is when they get Macmillan Cancer Charity to stop advertising on the Canary. It's this huge thing, and they get like massive news stories from it, and it's really effective. And I went back and I looked at Twitter and the reporting, and the original tweet that's sent out to say to Macmillan Cancer Charity, why are you advertising on the Canary, is sent out by a sock puppet account, like a made-up account called Ed Derwent, and the handle for Ed Derwent is Dave Gordstein, right? Again, like another layer of insanity on top of this stuff. And what I've realized over time, and I think the best way to think about this, because I've really struggled with how do I explain this to people in a succinct way? And actually, I think we need to understand it as we've been told that Russia is engaged in massive disinformation exercises, which is true. And typical of Russian disinformation exercise is to not disclose your money, to present political actors as grassroots activists, and then to target the political system using a vector of identity to do so. So to my mind, actually Stop Funding Fake News, which presents itself, and they'll defend themselves as like this virtuous campaign against hate and misinformation, I see it actually as something way worse and actually very corrosive, which is a disinformation campaign that looks, similar to what we expect a Russian disinformation campaign to be, to really subvert our information systems and our democracy in like a really underhanded way, and in a way that very effectively policed the thought crime of denialism.
Can you just explain what denialism is? Talk about its significance to this story.
Okay. So the issue of denialism is a really massive part of the anti-Semitism crisis. And I should point out that in the book, I tried to deal with anti-Semitism crisis very sensitively. Oh, sorry, that's my phone. Let me just stop that quickly. Do not disturb. Sorry. So let me begin from the beginning. So I have a chapter in my book on the anti-Semitism crisis. And I try to deal with it as sensitively as I can because it's a very nuanced and complex topic. Because I think there's a bit of a tendency. I basically take the approach of Martin Ford Casey, who was asked by the party to investigate anti-Semitism and racism. And his approach, I think, is the right one, which is to say, yes, there was anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. There plainly was. But it became so snarled in factionalism that it produced all these malignant outcomes on both the left and the right. Right. Now, denialism is this idea that the level of anti-Semitism and the type of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party was so well established by the mainstream media narrative that if you questioned the way it was propagated, if you questioned the more absurd examples like the ones I've just given you now, then you were denying the extent of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. And if you deny the extent of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, it means that inferentially you don't care about anti-Semitism or you're an anti-Semite yourself. Right. And that is an incredibly Kafkaesque situation to be in. Because what you have, if you look at the anti-Semitism crisis, is this very infuriating mixture of serious stories and nonsense stories. Like serious stories of anti-Semitism with like totally absurd stories of anti-Semitism. And people who are saying, well, hold on, this is not being dealt with properly because we're having this melange of stuff. We want to discuss it. Were branded as denialists. And primarily, the targets of denialists, the claim of denialism, are Jewish people. Because there's loads of people in the Labour Party who are left-wing, or some who are not left-wing in the Labour Party, who say, well, look, this is not my experience of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. I don't like the way this is being debated and argued. I think it's being done in a hysterical way. I think it's being pushed by actors who are not being disclosed to us. I think what it's doing, what they're worried about for a lot of them, is that it's chilling the reasoned debate we need to have about the nature of the state of Israel because people are conflating criticism of Israel and anti-Semitism. All these like very complex issues. Denialism says if you do any of that, you're an anti-Semite. And there's so many people in the Labour Party who are Jewish who are effectively accused of anti-Semitism for making that very reasonable statement, which is like, I think there's a mixture of real and silly stuff here. And we need to have a debate about what is real so we can deal with it and what is silly so we can ignore it. And Stop Finding Fake News, the role Stop Finding Fake News does is it polices denialism. It says that if you do that, one of the pieces of evidence they use against the Canary, for example, is an article called Jewish Labour Members Are Tired of the Anti-Semitism Crisis. And it's an interview of Jewish people saying, we don't think this anti-Semitism crisis is being propagated in a way that's helpful to fighting anti-Semitism. And that's treated by Stop Funding Fake News, run by a whole bunch of non-Jewish people, as evidence of denialism, which is evidence in their mind of hate.
And can you talk about the way that denialism was used to target and purge enemies of the Starmer project?
Sure. I mean, it effectively becomes one of the primary vectors of complaint. So actually, the way the anti-Semitism crisis basically worked was that you had a period of sort of 2018, 2017, where the anti-Semitism crisis is primarily driven by people like Labour Against Anti-Semitism going into social media, doing these massive deep dives into presumed Labour Party members, discovering a post they made in 2008 where they said, Israel is an apartheid state. And then they submitted complaints about that into the Labour Party, which fueled this idea that there was a massive amount of anti-Semitism the Labour Party wasn't dealing with. But really, from that point, the well runs dry. There's actually not that many examples that can then be put forward of like people saying the Rothschilds run the world. Because actually within the Labour Party, that's a pretty marginal opinion, just like it's a marginal opinion in the rest of society. It's actually more marginal in the Labour Party than it is in other places, which a number of different surveys have actually proven. But the idea is, at that point, denialism takes on a different force because there are loads of people who start saying this doesn't hang right to us. We think this is not right. We think doesn't make sense to us. That then fuels a whole new wave of allegations of anti-Semitism, which then drives the crisis forward. And it becomes very problematic. It becomes extremely problematic when the party is investigated by the Equalities and Human Rights Commission. And we can come back to this in a bit. But the substance of the Equalities and Human Rights Commission, one of the things they found was that there was a councillor who had, in their finding, harassed the Jewish community by putting up statements online where she had questioned the scale of of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. The Equalities and Human Rights Commission effectively codified into law in their findings the idea that denialism is a crime that exists and is anti-Semitic. And at that point, that supercharges the Labour Party bureaucracy because then they can say anybody who could even be suspected of denialism can't stand as a candidate. Anybody who's exposed to any criticism or skepticism, we run the risk of being found guilty of harassment of Jewish people they cannot stand at all. And at that point, there's just so many people who are expelled, so many Jewish people who are expelled, that at least there's exodus from the party. There's Corbyn being suspended. But actually, I think at a grassroots level, it's the number of Jewish people or high-profile figures like Ken Loach being expelled from the Labour Party, which just drives this exodus. And the Labour Party under Morgan McSweeney and Keir Starmer quite likes that, I think. Because they're like, well, if you're leaving, you're not going to vote against us. If you're leaving, leave us basically fuck off, close the door on your way out.
An extensive report laid out evidence of Islamophobia within the Labour Party, finding that 29% of Muslim members had directly experienced it, 37% had witnessed it, and 48% did not believe the party took it seriously. And you also mentioned in the book internal party emails showing that BAME members were equally distressed. How does the Labour Party's approach to that evidence of racism match the approach they take to anti-Semitic racism?
I mean, the straightforward answer is that I have a whole section in my book which I call the Labour Party a lawless and a racist party, effectively, because one of the consequences of the takeover of the Labour Party by this political project is that I feel that they effectively don't care, or they certainly behave like they don't care about anti-black racism and Islamophobia, and it drives this deep sense of alienation that Black and Muslim members have, which is now being reflected by the fact that so many of them have now abandoned the party. And, in my mind, the evidence that I have shows that the Labour Party is either indifferent to anti-black racism and Islamophobia, or at times is willing to even weaponize forms of racism and Islamophobia to achieve political ends. So there couldn't be a vaster difference between the way in which the Labour Party, invests huge amounts of resources in dealing with anti-Semitism in very problematic ways that we can come to, as compared to how they deal with anti-black racism and Islamophobia. This is not nearly the same degree of focus, and that's something that is both. I think the best way to illustrate that story for me is Martin Ford. So for those people who don't know, Martin Ford is a very well-respected black KC, a barrister with an incredible history behind him. Played a very prominent role in representing Windrush families and looking for compensation for Windrush families. In 2020, there's this internal Labour Party report that gets leaked, which alleges that the right-wing bureaucracy had basically undermined the party, and when Jeremy Corbyn was leader, and created this very factional, toxic atmosphere that included incidents of racism and an indifference to actually properly dealing with anti-Semitism. And they appoint Martin Ford KC to do an investigation, which he does over 2 years, and it's a good investigation, it's a good report, and it's a very thorough, reasoned, thought-through thing. The substance of the report, really at the end, it's a plea to the Labour Party. It's saying Martin Ford has this whole annexure at the end where they reproduce these first-person accounts from black and Bay members of staff who are saying the Labour Party doesn't take our concerns seriously. The Labour Party is running operating an effective hierarchy of racism in which anti-Jewish racism is taken incredibly serious and no other forms of racism are taken seriously. And in fact, it's so profound that it's getting to the point where the level of disregard for our concerns, it almost amounts to racism. But really what Ford is saying is like, please take this seriously. You've got black staff members and black members saying you have to take this seriously. And the party responds just so awfully to Martin Ford. It's sort of hard to wrap your head around. On the one hand, as soon as the report comes out, they basically undermine it through briefings almost immediately. Then they don't even let Martin Ford address the actual topics of his report, which is about the hierarchy of racism, right? It's about, how do we deal? He says very explicitly the Labour Party itself now has to deal with these issues, right? And when he tries to talk in public about it, he's approached by Al Jazeera and then he gives a media interview. The Labour Party sends him legal letters and says, do not speak to the media. He sees them off, but they're very hostile letters. So you've got a black KC who's been brought in to look at Labour Party issues around racism and the hierarchy of race. They said, yes, there are issues of racism here. Yes, you are operating, or you seem to be operating, a hierarchy of racism. And the response to the Labour Party is to basically tell him to shut up. And they ignore him and they treat him really abysmally.
Let's go back to Labour Together then and to the 2017 election. And can you talk about the Ergon House scheme? Firstly, just explain what it is and talk about its significance.
So what happens in 2017, I think the Labour Party is a very complex beast, right? So what you have is the elected leadership, which at that stage is Jeremy Corbyn, but the Labour Party is this massive bureaucracy that sits underneath it, which primarily its primary function, and it organizes all logistics and then organizes meetings. Primarily, I think its function is to police its members, make sure they don't step out of line. When Jeremy Corbyn takes over the Labour Party, the bureaucracy that he inherits, which is very powerful, generally despises him and despises the left wing because it's a bureaucracy that's been put in place from subsequent Blairite administrations and they all inhabit and express those ideas. And it's a pretty toxic environment, right? It's a really, really toxic, thick of its style political environment. And what happens in 2017 is the election is called. There is this assumption amongst those Labour right-wingers in the bureaucracy, including the General Secretary, that the Labour Party is going to, absolutely collapse into a heap and will be just burned down, get, no votes whatsoever, and it'll cease to exist effectively. And almost immediately after that happens, the election is called. This Labour Party bureaucracy starts saying, well, what we've got to do is with the limited financial resources that we have, because they didn't they didn't know at the time they were going to raise loads of money through individual donations. They said, we don't have much money. We've got to make sure the money that we do have in the Labour Party is used to protect our allies. And there's a conversation specifically about we must do everything we can to protect Tom Watson, who's the deputy of the Labour Party, and a sort of he's the organizing node for this right-wing fight back. Now, that's sort of been, the existence of this sort of plan has sort of been known about, but basically I have internal Labour Party documents, which allows me to reconstruct a much more important and detailed examination of it. And what it shows is actually is that from immediately as the election is called, the first thing the bureaucracy does is factionally allocate funds to a whole bunch of people who are not in seats that are in danger. Amongst those people who receive allocations, the constituencies that receive allocations, is Keir Starmer. Keir Starmer is one of the people who benefits from this scheme, but it's also people like Shabana Mahmood, Rachel Reeves, Pat McFadden, all the people who currently form my government, right? Then, for whatever reason, I think basically because there's the fear potentially of discovery, or it's not running. Basically there's a moment that happens around about the 10th of May, where that sort of more ad hoc scheme is turned into a more like regularized scheme. And what they do is the Labour Party bureaucracy, without telling the Labour Party leadership at all, without actually telling the formally constituted campaign what they're doing, is that they move all the staff over to a spillover office called Ergon House, which is the Labour Party is renting. And those staff at Ergon House are then put on the task of producing election materials and all sorts of stuff for their factional allies. And they secretly, without telling the Labour Party leadership, divert £250,000 of the Labour Party's quite limited electoral resources towards funding this project. In the end, they don't even spend all that money. That's the thing that drives me mad, is that they don't, there's about £90,000 that it's not spent. At the same time as that's happening, there's a guy called Steve Howe, who's basically the campaign manager, effectively, for the formal campaign, who was saying to the Labour Party bureaucracy, I want to target these marginal seats that I think that we can win with flyering and last minute stuff. I think we can swing these by 3 or 4% with that collateral and win those seats and start building towards a majority. And he's being told there's no money, when in fact they're diverting that money to right-wing Labour Party MPs, a lot of whom don't need the money because they're in safe seats, right? Now, what I established from what I'm looking at, I can't make a determination about whether that lost the Labour Party the election. What I can say is the Labour Party would have done better than it otherwise would have done if that money was spent on marginal seats instead of safe seats. That's very obvious to me, right? But the key thing for me about Ergon House is that it's plainly wrong. Unite writes to the Labour Party after it's only discovered in 2020. Unite writes to the Labour Party and says, you need to investigate this. This is serious stuff. We're worried that the money we gave you and our members gave you has been misused. We're worried that there may have been crimes committed here. And I don't know if that's true or not, but they say, we want you to investigate. We want you to appoint a forensic auditor to look into this, examine it. And the Labour Party has never done that. Not once. The Labour Party under Keir Starmer has never investigated Ergon House.
So talk about the role of Labour Together in Starmer's victory as the leader of the Labour Party, and just talk about the significance of Labour Together in the Starmer project.
So at the same time that Morgan McSweeney and the Labour Together project busy trying to undermine Corbynism as much as they can through their various campaigns and trying to destroy independent media, they're also incubating a leadership campaign. And what we know is that at least in July, actually in April, around about April 2018, Keir Starmer is already kicking about the idea that he might want to run for Labour leader at the time, which is a pretty ambitious thing, seeing he's only been, an MP for quite a short period of time. But he convenes this group called the Arlington Group that meets for a while. But the key moment is July 2019, because July 2019 is when Morgan McSweeney is invited to a meeting. And what he does is he presents this incredibly detailed analysis of the Labour Party's membership. Then that analysis is based on a vast amount of polling that he has done using his undisclosed funds, his illegally undisclosed funds, to find out the opinions of the Labour Party. And it basically sets out like a roadmap for how to win an election in the Labour Party, how you must present yourself to win over different parties, factions, and they're segmented into different, idealists and realists. But basically from that moment, Morgan McSweeney, while he's still, company secretary of Labour Together, full-time employed, basically gets given a role on this incipient incubated campaign. And they incubate Keir Starmer's leadership all the way through from July 2019 onwards. So when Keir Starmer launches his leadership bid, it's a leadership bid that's effectively been curated ahead of time by Labour Together, which has told them exactly how to win the Labour Party membership over, which is to basically present yourself as like an eco-socialist of the Corbynite tradition, radically democratic, wants to end factionalism, unite the party, will bring in all sorts of internal party reforms to make it more democratic, will abolish the House of Lords, will nationalise things, all the talking points of the Labour Party left wing. When it seems very clear, as we now know, they do none of those things, and in fact, they do the opposite of those things. They denude Labour Party democracy rather than enhance it. Another thing that's interesting is that, during the campaign, there was no public knowledge that Labour Together was behind the campaign, right? There was no disclosure. And in fact, you have Shabana Mahmood writes this article in February 2020 for Labourlist, where she says Labour Together is not backing any particular candidate in this race. And that's very problematic. I mean, she's the Home Secretary now, right? And Labour Together, 3 years later, actually broke cover and came clean and published a report and put it on their website and put it on Twitter. Actually, we were behind Keir Starmer's campaign the whole time, right? This is a fundamental, like, deep lack of transparency here, right? Because if we've known, if members had known that Labour Together were back in their campaign, what did that mean practically? First of all, people would be like, oh, Labour Together? Labour Together that doesn't have any money? How are you backing a campaign? Where's the money coming from? You haven't declared a single donation for the whole of 2019. What's going on here? At the same time that Keir Starmer himself is failing to disclose the donors he's getting money from during his own election campaign. That would raise some issues. But also Labour Together is, in the public mind, they've put out some statements about who they are and includes a whole bunch of right-wing Labour MPs like Wes Streeting and Rachel Reeves, and who are anathema, generally speaking, to the vast majority of Labour Party members at the time. So if it had been known, in fact, that Keir Starmer's campaign was being backed and run by an organisation associated with all these like Blairite MPs, people would be like, well, why are they backing this campaign when you're saying that you love Jeremy Corbyn and Diane Abbott and you think Stop the War is amazing and you want to investigate all arms sales to Saudi Arabia and you want to nationalise every industry? This doesn't seem to hang together. And it's another part of what I think is like a premeditated deception. The Labour Party membership was totally unaware of what they were voting for, because actually what they were voting for in Keir Starmer was to vote in a man who was the figurehead for this incredibly narrow, tiny little faction of the Labour Party, which in general terms pretty much hates every other faction of the Labour Party and wants to kick them out of it. And that's what we see happen.
So there's a straight line between the way Starmer wins the Labour leadership election and the way he then goes on to win the general election. Can you just talk about the significance of Morgan McSweeney in that, and also about how that ultimately led to his position now as the least popular prime minister in polling history?
So what you see in that campaign is I think, two aspects of McSweeney's political methodology. So the one is this obsession with polling, obsession with finding out what people want in the party or wherever, whatever your target audience is, and then basically running a campaign says, we'll do all that, even if you don't intend to do any of that stuff. Even if within the Labour Party it says, well, we want to nationalise things, but actually you think that's crazy, which is really a campaign of premeditated deception, which is to find out what people want, reflect it back at them, to win their votes, and then betray them, which is precisely what happens. And the second aspect of it is what I call in the book shadowing. And this is not a very sophisticated political methodology, but it's used throughout and still being used, I think, in ways that I think will destroy the Labour Party potentially, which is that McSweeney identifies, and really McSweeney is at the heart of Keir Starmer's, both his campaigns. He is the campaign chief for 2020 for the leadership campaign. He's also the head of the campaign in 2024, and he's deciding what goes into the manifesto in 2024. He's deciding what goes into whatever Keir Starmer says to the public, literally writing at times what Keir Starmer has to say. And the methodology is very simple. They identify their opponent, and then they copy that opponent, and they box them out. So in 2020, their opponent is Rebecca Long-Bailey, who is seen as like the heir of the Corbynite. And what you see is actually what people didn't realize is that Starmer starts his campaign, he's left-wing, but then Rebecca Long-Bailey tries to create some distance between herself and Starmer, right? And that comes in February 2020, and she says to the public, I'm now putting down the gauntlet. I will back the nationalisation of mail, rail, water, and energy. That's what I want to do. At that stage, Keir Starmer hasn't backed those things. The only thing he said is, well, maybe I'll nationalise rail, but he hasn't committed to nationalising anything else. But then a week thereafter, he says, yes, I agree. I think we should nationalize these things. And he does these TV debates where he's asked explicitly, will you agree to nationalize mail, rail, energy, and water? And he puts up his hand and says, yes, I will. Right. So he's following her. And actually, I spoke to members of Rebecca Long Bailey's campaign who were infuriated, who were like really frustrated by it because they were like, every time we come up with a policy, he copies. One of the other things is like Rebecca Long Bailey says, I want to abolish the House of Lords. And hey presto, 2 weeks later, Keir Starmer saying, I want to abolish the House of Lords. Right. And it's infuriating to them because they can't make any space. And he adopts this left-wing position. And of course, what happens as soon as he wins, all of that stuff goes out the window. In fact, he denies later that he ever promised to nationalize anything, even though there's such loads of video evidence, which they again speaks to like this guy's and this project's like total reliance on dishonesty, often dishonesty straight to people's faces, which is like gets close to gaslighting territories at times. And then that's repeated. That methodology is then repeated. So they win the Labour leadership. Then they have to pivot to the next opponent. And at that stage, their opponent is the Tories. And again, what they do is that they start polling the whole country for what their views are. And they say, well, we've got to basically copy these views. We've got to copy what the Tories are doing. And they move the Labour Party from, this very left-wing position to effectively being indistinguishable from the Tories on all sorts of things, right? On tax policy, on immigration, on law and order, on crime, on the environment. And it's an interesting period because it's in April. I write about it quite extensively. I think it's such a fascinating document. In April 2023, Labour Together sort of relaunches and they publish this thing called Redshift, which is basically a guide to how to win the election. And it's fascinating because it's basically at that stage, Morgan McSweeney and Labour Together are very closely aligned. Josh Simons is saying in public, we do everything with Morgan McSweeney. And it sets out this methodology pretty explicitly. We've polled the public. The public holds views that are more conservative than the vast majority of Labour MPs and the vast majority of Labour members, and actually our core vote, our centrist vote, our votes in our cities. But they don't matter because they're going to vote for us anyway. So what we've got to do is we've got to box out the Tories on their battle turf. And that's exactly what they do. And they basically copy the Tories as much as possible. That leads to their manifesto in 2024, which is generally like a genuinely appalling document. One, because it's so unambitious in and of itself, but two, because it's just nonsense. It's just rubbish. And anybody worth their salt, was looking at this at the time and saying, this is nonsense. Every economist was saying, the figures you're putting in here, the things you're saying you're going to do without raising taxes is nonsense. This is rubbish. There's a black hole coming. We all know there's a black hole coming. Why are you pretending there's not? And of course, that's exactly what happens after the election. So that election runs, they basically run as a carbon copy of the Tories. They produce this incredibly misleading manifesto. They barely, they win this landslide on a very small turnout, on a very small, it's the most disproportionate victory in terms of the number of votes they got and the seats they got. They get 33% of the votes nationally, but they win like the vast majority of seats. And then immediately as they win power, they start behaving like completely differently to what they pretended. And one good example of that, I think, one that I come to again and again and again, and I think it's the moment I feel the most angry at the media in the UK, is that throughout the election, Keir Starmer presents himself as like, I'm a man of service, I'm a man of integrity. The Tories have been corrupt, which they have been. The Tories are covered in sleaze. I'm going to be a different sort of person. And I remember sitting and watching his leadership debates, and he's saying this, and I was like screaming at the TV. Because by then, if you had half a brain and you Googled him and you Googled his registered members interested, you'd see he's taken like £100,000 in freebies, right? He's taken luxury holidays, he's gone to like free football matches, he's gone to the races, which is like tacky in and of itself. But it's also, I think, very irresponsible. Because what he's done is, before he's even become prime minister, he's already conflicted himself in all sorts of areas where he's going to have to govern, right? If you're taking money from gambling companies, it means you're conflicted when you regulate gambling. When you take money from football for football clubs, you conflicted when you have to regulate the football industry, which is what they end up doing. It's a deeply irresponsible thing, and there's a total media silence. Nobody's reporting this thing that you can find if you Google it. And then as soon as the election is over, people discover it. And at the time, I was actually calling journalists, being like, do you know about this story? Do you know he's been taking all these freebies? I was telling everybody I knew, like, do you know about this? And there was just like this blank look. And then immediately after he wins the election, the story breaks. Oh, he's been taking freebies from Wahid Ali. Oh, what's he getting in return from it? Oh, this is a bit crass, isn't it? Isn't he just like the Tories we displaced? Right? And yes, he is just like the Tories we displaced. He has been taking freebies. He has been behaving irresponsibly. But that moment creates such a precipitous decline in trust. Because at the moment he's doing freebies, the freebies are being exposed, he's telling everybody we're going to start means testing the winter fuel allowance. Nothing that's ever been stated in the manifesto. We're going to be doing all these incredibly harsh things, which is going to throw loads of people into poverty. Loads of people into poverty. This is a Labour government that comes in. They've run on this this nonsense manifesto, but this residual sense that if they're going to find cuts, they're not going to fall on the most vulnerable. They're going to, they're going to do something that's a little bit better than the Tories. And then from that moment, it's all downhill. And that in itself, I think there's two things that I think that are important. One is the actual political methodology of winning power was meant they won the election, but they lost government. In that repeatedly, and it's such an interesting thing. You see Rachel Reeves in 2023, she publishes this pamphlet for Labour Together called Securonomics. And she basically says, we're going to, as the Labour Party, we're going to have this economic philosophy, which is that we're going to use the state to drive investment. We're going to spend £28 billion a year on the Green New Deal, effectively. And that's going to drive economic growth. That's going to be our economic platform. And then basically, Morgan McSweeney says, no, you can't do that. Because if you say that, the Tories are going to attack you. So they cancel that. And then it becomes, oh, we're going to cut red tape in housing, which is never going to produce the growth that you want. And now in government, their growth plan is investing in the defense industry, cutting foreign aid, investing in the defense industry. Those are three completely different, radically different economic approaches. What it means is the one thing that was in Labour Party's gift at the time, which is to offer the Green New Deal, is killed because of an electoral strategy. It says, no, you can't promise to spend anything, or it then ties the Labour Party's hands in government, right? And we were talking earlier about the Ming vase strategy. The idea was that you've got to carry this Ming vase over and you've got to protect it. And I think it's such a good analogy, actually, people didn't realize that they were saying Morgan McSweeney has got this very fragile thing. He needs to get it over the line. You can't upset anybody. You can't give them any attack lines. But a Ming vase is empty. You don't put anything into a Ming vase. A Ming vase is decorative. It's too valuable to fill with anything. So he delivers the Ming vase over the line, and then people say, well, let's see what's in your vase. And it's empty. There's nothing in there. Or actually, what they find is something completely different to what they expect, which is suddenly this Labour government that's doing austerity again, or some version of austerity. And that then leads to a collapse in support immediately, which then leads to the rise of Nigel Farage. And then, in that moment, the response is not to learn from that past mistake, it's to be like, let's use exactly the same political methodology that we've always used. We've identified our opponent, which they've done to the last Labour conference. Our opponent is now Nigel Farage. And we're going to do two things. We're going to shadow him. We're going to say all his concerns are legitimate, but he's too crazy to actually do anything about it. But effectively, they've moved so far to the right on issues of immigration that Shabana Mahmood is as the Home Secretary now, and obviously her roots are in the Labour Together project. She was very close to Morgan McSweeney for a long time. She's, almost indistinguishable. I'd say she's to the right of, a lot of former Tory Home Office secretaries. I think she's very little. There'd be almost no difference between her and like a Suella Braverman in terms of the policy adopting. Of course, the Labour Party then, proscribes Palestine Action as a terrorist group and is now arresting grannies holding up signs, like a really authoritarian response. And this, I think, is the heart of what's going to destroy the Labour Party, I think. If this carries on as a political methodology, the Labour Party will fracture into a million pieces. Because what they don't seem to understand is they seem to be operating on the belief that people have nowhere else to go. They don't understand at a very fundamental level that their voting coalition is made up of like cosmopolitan, progressive, liberal people living in urban centers who know immigrants, who are generally pro-immigration or don't like the demonization of immigrants, who are progressive economically on all sorts of things. And the Labour Party is going to spend 3 years in government as the government doing all these right-wing things that they find abhorrent. Those people are not going to vote for the Labour Party. The electoral coalition that's been created by the Labour Party will cease to exist because people will be so angry at it. And we see that in polling now. I mean, I don't know if it's going to come to fruition. If they change tack, you never know. But on current trajectory, I can't see how this ends anywhere but the Labour Party's own voting coalition being like, you know what? I can't get behind a party that is as cruel to immigrants and asylum seekers and refugees as Farage is. I can't get behind an economic, like this next budget is going to happen, which is going to be a series of tax rises and spending cuts. We can't get behind this anymore. People will leave and they'll go somewhere else. And it'll potentially destroy the Labour Party in a very poetic way, because obviously the Labour Party starts with Keir, maybe it'll end with Keir, right? Maybe this is the project that brings this 100-year-old party to an end. And what it reminds me of is I wrote this book I'm from South Africa, and I wrote this book in 2011 called Devil in the Detail, and it was about the corruption that had infected South Africa, the corruption that I felt that was going to destroy the prospects of like a prosperous post-apartheid democratic state that was governing in the interests of its people. And I ended that book. It was such a long, big, deep story. I started in the 1980s and I carried it all the way through to the present. And I ended up saying like we are on the edge of full-scale state capture, which is exactly what happened. I had this appalling sense in 2011 of seeing this nightmare ahead of me, the nightmare for South Africa, and like screaming, being like, please pay attention. Please pay attention to this. It's serious. It doesn't matter your political persuasion. It doesn't matter if you're left wing or right wing, if you're a centrist. This is a concern. This is a threat to our democracy. And I feel the same way. After I finished this book, writing this book, I felt the same. And I was like, I know it's going to be received in the media ecosystem and with people. I've written it from a very explicitly left-wing perspective. It's plain that I'm left-wing, but this book is not just for left-wing people. This book is for everyone because I'm sounding the alarm. I'm sounding an alarm about this incredibly reckless political project that doesn't care about key things about our democracy. It doesn't care about decency and honesty. It doesn't care about the law, I don't think. It doesn't care about civil liberties. And it doesn't care who it throws under bus to maintain power.
And one of the most shocking stories in your book concerns a publication called Inside Croydon. Can you talk about that?
Sure. So I think what this speaks to the Inside Croydon story, if I can just sort of, preface it, I think the Inside Croydon story speaks to this like real hostility within this particular faction to accountability and to anybody telling a story they don't like. Because this faction is so used to being able to tell, work with their colleagues in certain media outlets to tell a story that's never challenged. But Inside Croydon is this terrifying. So to me, it's actually terrifying. I don't think it's salacious. I think it's terrifying. So Inside Croydon is a local blog and media outlet run by this great guy called Stephen Downes. Now, Stephen Downes, if you ever meet him, is like straight out of like a pulp novel. He's like the essence of like the do not mess around, curmudgeonly, cantankerous, local journalist pounding the pavement, gumshoe, getting shit done journalist, right? He's following the story no matter where it goes. And the stories that he's following at the time, the Labour Party who are running Croydon Council are running it into the ground in 2020, basically because they've made all these incredibly bizarre baroque decisions around housing policy. The Croydon Council effectively has to declare bankruptcy and have to be bailed out. I think it's 120 million pounds they get bailed out to in the end. And it happens again in November 2022. And Inside Croydon is like one of the only outlets in the country that is like systematically exposing this poor governance, these terrible decisions, often like quite tongue-in-cheek, often quite biting, quite satirical, but very, very, very solid, good accountability, investigative journalism. The stuff that's like the lifeblood of like our democracy really is like those sort of journalists who do that sort of thing locally. And one of the people that aggravates is Steve Reid. And Steve Reid's an MP. He's now the housing minister, very close to Morgan McSweeney, who's plainly part of the Labour Together project for a long time and has had his career really, go through the roof as a result of being associated with Morgan McSweeney. From about 2017 onwards, I have Labour Party files showing that Steve Reid and his local political allies, including this guy called Tony Newman, who's actually the head of the council that's being driven into the ground, try on at least two different occasions to get Stephen Downes expelled from the Labour Party because of what he's reporting. And they present these dossiers and say, this is hate, this is misinformation. This is harassment. He needs to be kicked out of the Labour Party. When it's actually just accountability journalism. And of course, to tie it back to the beginning of the story, Steve Reid is also simultaneously a creator or knows about and definitely amplifies Stop Funding Fake News. So we can see this guy's attitude to what journalism is. Like journalism that's uncomfortable for him and holds his colleagues to account is misinformation and hate. But it gets really, really dark in 2021 because somebody hacks inside Croydon's email server. And Stephen Downes reports that to the police and to the ICO. And what the ICO says is that it's likely that the passwords to your email server have been bought on the dark web, so effectively bought from organized crime. In terms of say, I should just say one of the things that's striking about Inside Croydon is the fact how much they report on Reid and on Reid's allies, a guy called David Evans and the campaign company, and they're reporting on conflicts of interest in relation to contracts that are being awarded to David Evans' company. Now, David Evans becomes the general secretary of the Labour Party, very close Morgan McSweeney ally, right? And when they're doing these purges and controlling the party and basically capturing it, it's effectively like a trifecta of Morgan McSweeney and Steve Reid and David Evans. And Inside Croydon has been reporting on these contracts that have been given by Croydon um, to Steve Reid. Later, incidentally, Inside Croydon would also start raising issues about contracts that have been awarded to Imogen Walker. And Imogen Walker is Morgan McSweeney's wife. That's after the story, but an interesting tale. But the hack happens. And it's very clear why the hack has happened, because at the same time as the email server is hacked, Inside Croydon's Twitter account is hacked. And the person who hacks the Twitter account posts up, I've got into this account basically. And Inside Croydon's confidential sources are, and it lists these four Labour councillors or three Labour councillors who it says have been supplying Inside Croydon with information that he shouldn't have. What they're actually saying is that there's three Labour councillors who are blowing the whistle about governance failures. Right. Then what happens is that these emails that have been hacked, a couple of days later, they get emailed into the Labour Party. It's sent into an email you can show the email, but the email actually has Steve Reid on it and a couple of other key Labour Party bureaucrats and says, they call it the Inside Croydon leaks. It's actually Inside Croydon hack. Here are all these emails from Inside Croydon. It seems to me that we can identify these people who have been speaking to him and we should take disciplinary action against them. And those emails then go spread throughout the Labour Party bureaucracy. And Reid is again copied into further emails, where those emails are then used to punish Inside Croydon's confidential sources. I mean, that's really like it's a despicable incident, generally despicable, that you have a genuine, legitimate media outlet reporting on the collapse of a Croydon council because being misgoverned. And somebody's hacked that outlet to find out who its confidential sources are. Then the Labour Party has taken that material to then punish those confidential sources. When it should have done a couple of things. It should have immediately called Stephen Downes and been like, we've got these emails. We'll collaborate with the ICO in investigating how they were hacked. Two, we're going to report it to the Met Police on your behalf that this has happened, and we'll deal with this. And they do the exact opposite. Not only do they not report it to the police and authorities, they weaponize that information against people who have been providing Inside Croydon with key information. It's really just an astonishingly messed up story.
And can you talk about the leaked report? So, what is the leaked report and why is it significant in this story?
Sure. So the leaked report is published in April 2020. And the background to that is that there's been such a furor around anti-Semitism in the Labour Party that a body called the Equalities and Human Rights Commission, which is supposed to investigate, it basically upholds equalities law in the UK, initiates an investigation into the Labour Party. And the Labour Party is told to discover all sorts of information to the EHRC. At the time, the staff who are working for the Labour Party don't know what happened. The EHRC, they can't tell the EHRC what's actually happened because it didn't work at the time that a lot of the queries were about. So they use an internal search tool and they basically uncover all this information. But in doing so, these staff discover, amongst other things, Ergon House. Amongst other things, these incredibly problematic WhatsApp conversations between the most senior members of the bureaucracy and other staff members that, are saying pretty gnarly things about Diane Abbott. And what it reveals is this like totally toxified political culture, like really broken. And that report, they basically take all that information and they produce a report. This very substantive 850-page report that deals with factionalism in the Labour Party, that deals with racism in the Labour Party, but also I think very importantly, what it does is it raises problems with the mainstream analysis and reporting on the anti-Semitism crisis. And says actually this is much more complicated than you think, because the reason why the Labour Party hasn't been dealing with complaints properly is because factionalism has so broken this organisation that complaints have just been ignored and not been dealt with. And actually, it's under the Corbynite bureaucracy that we've tried to put in systems to deal with this. And they give an example of like the anti-Corbyn bureaucracy for years, or not for years, sorry, I think for a couple of months, there was an email inbox where complaints were coming in that wasn't even being monitored, right? And they're like, this is appalling. And then somehow that report gets leaked in April 2020, just after Keir Starmer becomes leader. And we don't know who leaked it. Nobody knows who leaked it. The ICO investigator couldn't establish. There's been 3 investigations. Nobody's known who leaked it. And there's basically to my mind, there was only really one legitimate response to the leaked report, which is to say, yeah, it might be a factional document, it might be written by Corbyn staff, but there's enough material stuff in here that needs to be dealt with. Plainly, it speaks to like a totally messed up political culture. We should use the leaked report's evidence to basically clean house, start afresh, build a professional organization. The problem is that what the leaked report does is it actually exposes all the bureaucrats who were allies of Morgan McSweeney. Right. It exposes all of the people that Morgan McSweeney actually wants to have in the Labour Party. And what people haven't really understood, I don't think, is that when Morgan McSweeney, so there's a period of time, you have 2016 to 2018, you have this right-wing Labour Party bureaucracy, which is very toxic. Then you have a Corbynite bureaucracy, which is a little bit better, still has its problems. And then 2020. And what people don't understand is the 2020 moment, the modality of capturing the party is to effectively restore that toxic culture that existed between 2016 and 2018, the same methodology, in some instances, it's the same people, literally brought back in. One of the people they bring back in is Paul Ovenden, who then becomes the director of strategy at Number 10, and who my book has led to his resignation, because actually the leaked report had mentioned Paul Ovenden, and there were additional emails on the Labour Party server which showed him sharing email conversational chats with another white staffer, saying pretty gnarly things about Diane Abbott, right? And I argue that illustrates the extent to which the Keir Starmer and the Labour Party didn't give a shit about the leaked report, which is very problematic because the leaked report isn't just about a political culture, it's about racism. And the thing that comes through so plainly in all the emails that I've seen is that Black and Asian and minority ethnic MPs and members are horrified by the leaked report. They're horrified by the treatment of Diane Abbott, and they want it to be dealt with. And in fact, you have the opposite. You have all the people who are mentioned in the leaked report. Nothing actually ever happens to them, get slaps on the wrist on most occasions. Quite a few of them have actually been paid off recently in a libel case. Some of them are allowed to retain their jobs. The people the party accuses of leaking the report with no evidence whatsoever, on like incredibly flimsy evidence, get put through like that legal ringer and cost the party an absolute fortune in failed cases. And what it illustrates is like just this total disregard for racism in the Labour Party. And that then is then amplified because there's Martin Ford who investigates that report. And it's in Martin Ford who says the crime of Martin Ford for the Labour Party is that Martin Ford looks at the leaked report and says it's a factional document, but actually quite a lot of it's true. Quite a lot of it is accurate. Quite a lot of it is accurate about the type of bureaucrats that Morgan McSweeney is an ally of. And that is an unforgivable offence in the minds of the Labour Party bureaucracy and the right wing. And for that, Ford is effectively punished, I think. He's ostracized, he's alienated, he's briefed against, and he's threatened legally for having the temerity of questioning it. And it's almost in that moment you see they don't quite frame it in that way, but it's almost like another version of denialism. They treat this like very sober report written by Casey with a number of like distinguished lords, like baronesses working with him, which says actually the anti-Semitism crisis is slightly more complicated than you think, is effectively maligned and punished for saying that. And it's a very disturbing story.
So the Labour Party under Starmer continues to punish any dissent. And you talk about the example of Neil Lawson, who was in charge of a very well-known and long-established group called Compass. Just talk about what happened to him and also give us another couple of examples of this authoritarian streak going too far.
So Neil Lawson, and he's such an arresting character for me. And I've gotten to know Neil a little bit. I've spoken to him a few times. I think the first time he met me, he thought I was a bit weird and a bit cranky. Anyway, so I was asking sort of pointed questions about Morgan McSweeney, and I think he found it a bit odd. At the time, I don't think he quite realized the nature of the political project that he'd first encountered. Because to his mind, he'd spent lots of time with Morgan McSweeney in 2018, 2019, when Morgan McSweeney effectively conned him and said, I want to do Corbynism without Corbyn, and gets buy-in from Neil Lawson, who then, really mobilizes a lot of like personal and political capital to support this project. And then in 2023, Neil Lawson is suspended from the Labour Party, like totally like a bolt out of the blue. He's suspended, and my reading of it has always been that part of the offence that Neil Lawson had committed is that by then he's already starting to write about what he thinks are the authoritarian tendencies in the Labour Party and its factionalism, but also because Compass hosts an event with Martin Ford, where Martin Ford is allowed to speak about his report. Before which, I should say, Martin Ford had actually gotten another stinging legal letter from the Labour Party saying, do not speak in public, which is just outrageous. And then almost immediately after the Compass event, he's suspended. And actually, as it turns out, I have the Labour Party files, that he's suspended based on a complaint from 2021 submitted by a guy called Luke Akehurst, who's now the MP for I think it's Durham North. Very prominent leading light on the right wing of the Labour Party, a big part of Progress Labour to win, that particular faction that they get so behind Starmerism. And he submitted this complaint back in 2021 because Neil Lawson tweeted basically, I think it's a good thing when like Lib Debs and Greens and the Labour Party work together. It's something to that effect. That's the essence of the tweet. And I can see from the Labour Party files that the Labour Party received this complaint from Luke Akehurst. Luke Akehurst said this shows he's supporting other parties, he needs to be kicked out. And the Labour Party bureaucracy was like, this is stupid. This is nonsense. And they basically put it into a folder that says no action required. And then it's reheated in 2023 and Neil Lawson is suspended. And it's actually this very arresting moment because Neil Lawson is very good friends with John Cruddas, who was the founder of the original version of Labour Together. And they both write these stinging letters in The Guardian saying, this is outrageous that Neil Lawson's been a member for 40 years. Like, he's incredibly well respected in the party. The idea that he's been kicked out is mad. This is a sign of a party machinery that's gone totally insane and has gone punitive. And it's a key moment because that I think is the beginning of a peel-off that is now accelerated amongst a lot of Labour insiders on the left or the centre left who are like, this project is mad and out of control. But of course, that's not the only example. So another good example is that, what they do is that from 2022, they're planning for government. And Morgan McSweeney and a couple of his key allies take over the process of controlling who gets elected as an MP. And they use this process of they basically cull all these MPs who they accuse of offences. And I'll give you an example of that. One of them, I was on Politics Live with a woman by the name of Emily Darlington, a Labour MP, and she's from Milton Keynes. And in Milton Keynes, there was a very well-respected, well-regarded left-wing member of the Labour Party called Lauren Townsend, who was a bit of a local legend because she'd actually I think she might get the story wrong, but she had led a process of unionizing her workplace, right? And delivering material benefits for workers. She was very popular. And she was, in the running to be selected to be the candidate for, I think it's Milton Keynes Central. And the Labour Party bureaucracy, effectively being directed by Morgan McSweeney and others, says you're not allowed to run as a Labour MP because during COVID, you like to tweet by Nicola Sturgeon, in which Nicola Sturgeon says, I have recovered from COVID, right? So on the basis of somebody of a left-winger saying, liking Nicola Sturgeon recovering from COVID, they're not allowed to stand as a Labour Party MP. It is mad. Then, of course, they all say, oh, it's the best quality candidates. It's too bad they've selected Jazz Atwell, who after the election, it turns out has been running, properties that are affected with, mold and all sorts of things, and it becomes the story about the Labour Party. The biggest landlord in Parliament is Jazz Atwell, and his properties, there's problems with them. So, and again, it's reflected with a lot of racism there because there's lots of black candidates who basically get stitched up. There's a guy called Maurice McLeod, for example, who he's very popular, former political editor of The Voice, which is aimed at the Afro-Caribbean community, and he's told he's not allowed to stand, basically on nonsense grounds. And a lot of people start discerning in it, I think correctly, that there is an undertone, or there's a side effect of black MPs and BAME MPs being excluded because generally speaking, BAME MPs appear more on the left of the party than on the right, basically. But then it also starts targeting Jewish people in really, really, really ugly ways. And the story I use to tell that, and it's a horrific story, and it's a very emotional story. It's about a woman by the name of Reva Joffe. And Reva Joffe was in Keir Starmer's constituency. She's Jewish. She's from a Jewish family. Her Jewish family had actually fled anti-Semitic persecution in Eastern Europe, had settled in South Africa in the 40s, and sort of they, in their retelling, their experience of persecution, but also something they think is inherent to their Jewishness, which is the fight against oppression, made them fight against apartheid. And for that, Reza Jaffe's father was imprisoned during World War II. He was actually imprisoned next to a whole bunch of literal Nazis and very right-wing prison guards and treated terribly. And after he's released, the family leaves and they move to the UK, where their house effectively becomes a safe house for a lot of like really amazing anti-apartheid activists and anti-racism activists like Paul Robeson and Elena Sisulu. And Reva Joffe basically learns from her parents, she's an anti-Zionist, and her anti-Zionism comes from what she sees as like her family's commitment to fighting oppression. And in 2021, she's got a terminal illness. She's rejoined the Labour Party, I think it's 2017. And it's been this emotional lifeline to her because her partner had died recently. And the Labour Party is what she re-energizes herself by joining the Labour Party. She becomes friends with these Labour Party activists. But in 2021, on her deathbed, literally on her deathbed, she gets a notice of investigation, the Labour Party, and it's accusing her of anti-Semitism. And there's two offences that it lists, and they're deeply silly. The one is that she once on Facebook called Israel an apartheid state, which I think is not just legitimate, I actually think it's accurate. And on the other case, she's complaining about she thought that Jeremy Corbyn had been too soft on responding to bad faith allegations of anti-Semitism, or what she saw as bad faith allegations of anti-Semitism. And one of the last things she has to do in her life is to write a response to the Labour Party saying, I'm not an anti-Semite. This is a mad allegation. And that was, in Labour Party circles and in left-wing circles, and, I didn't know her that well personally, but some of my friends did locally. This was seen as like this is like deeply, deeply offensive thing that happened. But then I discovered something more because then with my Labour Party files, I realized that one of the complaints that catalyzed the investigation into her had been submitted by David Gordstein. Right? So you have an elderly Jewish woman who's being investigated on her deathbed, one of her last political acts is writing why she's not an anti-Semite, responding to an allegation seeded by and submitted by a non-Jewish man who's created a fake identity, David Gordstein. It's mind-bending. But the story doesn't even end there. For the first, I got to meet Priva Jaffe's son for the first time this week, and it was very moving and very emotional. He was so deeply affected by the fact that his mother died while under investigation by the Labour Party for anti-Semitism that he wrote to the Labour Party repeatedly and said, "Can you please tell me you've at least closed this case? Can you please give me that little bit of closure that you don't still consider her potentially an anti-Semite?" And they've never responded to him. And he then got friends to write to Keir Starmer directly. He got my colleague Andrew Feinstein to write directly to Keir Starmer. Never got a response. He's never got a response. And I just think that is such an appalling story in its own terms. But what I think it really reflects is this deeply cynical, this like reckless treatment of anti-Semitism. If you care about anti-Semitism, if you really care about anti-Semitism, you can't read a story like that and be like, that's messed up. This is deeply unjust. This needs resolution. And the people who've been told, people like Keir Starmer and his administration, who've been told to rip anti-Semitism up by the roots, are actually the people doing this sort of thing. And that's the problem. That's the problem with the way anti-Semitism in the Labour Party is being treated, is that it's led to the way it's been factionalized. And again, I don't think anti-Semitism is made up. There's obviously an issue to be dealt with, but the way it's been used by certain political actors has produced these incredibly malignant outcomes. What I'm worried about, and I have to be very honest here, what I'm worried about my book is that I feel like there is an already accepted narrative around this issue that's being created by tens of thousands of newspaper articles. It's created an entire political reality. It's created a paradigm of how we understand our politics. And what I feel like my book might bump up against is challenging that paradigm. Because if you start going down this path and hearing those stories and asking some questions, you then really have to start rethinking at least aspects of the last decade of our political history, which suddenly looks very different to what we've been told it actually is. And I worry from a personal perspective that act of asking for us to re-examine that history and rethink that paradigm is going to just be rejected out of hand, or in the worst case scenario, will be seen as an act of bad faith. When actually, what I think I'm trying to do, what I hope I'm trying to do, what I'm trying to achieve, is to try and take this issue of anti-Semitism, which has been twisted and gnarled and messed up because of the way it's been involved in political things, not just the Labour Party, but the way it's been weaponized and used to stifle criticism of Israel and its conduct in Gaza, is to try and do something to straighten this out a bit so that we can have proper, reasoned debates about anti-Semitism that actually protects Jewish people. right? That protects people like Riva Joffe from this sort of treatment.